Empires didn't become powerful just by conquering land. History seems to show armies marching, borders expanding, flags rising over new territories. But that's only what we see on the surface, because the real power of empires came from something far more precise. They learned how to extract value from land again and again, not once, not temporarily, but endlessly. What looked like expansion was not just growth. It was design, a system built to turn distant territories into engines of constant profit. Resources flowed out, wealth flowed in, and the empire didn't just control land. It controlled the way that land produced value. Over time, this system became more refined, more efficient, more invisible. And once it began, it didn't stop when empires fell, because the structure remained. So if conquest wasn't the true source of power, what was this system? And how did it reshape the world in ways we still live with today? To understand that, we need to go back to where it all started. At first glance, colonial empires appear chaotic. Ships crossing oceans, soldiers moving across unfamiliar lands, distant territories scattered across the map with no clear pattern. It feels random, unstable, difficult to control. But beneath that surface, there was structure, because empires were not held together by movement alone. They were held together by systems. Quiet systems, deliberate systems, systems that organize resources, labor, and trade into something predictable, something repeatable. Raw materials moved in one direction, wealth moved in another, and in between, millions of people were placed into roles that kept the flow going. This wasn't accidental. It was designed. Land was not just claimed. It was assigned a purpose. Labor was not just used. It was structured. Trade was not just conducted. It was controlled. And once these pieces were connected, something powerful emerged. A steady, reliable stream of wealth moving back to the center of the empire. To understand empire, you don't just look at maps. You look at systems. Because the map shows where power existed, but the system explains how it worked. And once you begin to see that system, a deeper question begins to form. What problem was this system actually solving? Before the system emerged, wealth had limits, hard limits. It was tied to geography, to what could be grown locally, to what could be carried by land, and most importantly, to time. Trade was slow, painfully slow. Caravans moved across dangerous routes. Ships hugged coastlines, avoiding the unknown. Every journey carried risk. Storms, theft, delay. Nothing was guaranteed. Wealth, in this world, was fragile, unpredictable, difficult to scale. But then something began to change. Maritime networks expanded. Ships became stronger. Navigation improved. Oceans, once barriers, became pathways. And with that shift, distance stopped being a problem. It became an opportunity. Now, goods could move farther than ever before, faster, in greater volume. Entire regions, once isolated, were suddenly connected. And for the first time, empires could think beyond their borders, not just as areas to control, but as systems to integrate. Control was no longer just about land. It was about connection, about linking distant places into a single flow of resources and wealth. This changed everything, because once distance could be managed, a new question emerged. If territories could be connected, could they be optimized? And that's where the real transformation began. The challenge wasn't acquiring colonies. Empires had already proven they could do that. Ships could reach distant shores. Armies could claim land. Flags could be planted. But holding those territories, that was a different problem entirely, because distance came with a cost. Distant lands were expensive to maintain. Supplies had to travel across oceans. Administrators had to be placed far from the center of power. Communication was slow. Decisions took time. And uncertainty was everywhere. Local resistance, unfamiliar environments, unpredictable production. Nothing about colonies was stable. And without stability, there was no guarantee of profit. That was the real issue, because expansion on its own meant nothing. If a colony could not produce consistent value, it became a burden, a drain on resources, a risk instead of an advantage. Empires began to face a quiet contradiction. The more they expanded, the harder it became to sustain that expansion. So the question changed. It was no longer, how do we acquire more land? It became, how do we make that land reliable? How do we turn uncertainty into something controlled, something predictable, something repeatable? And once that question was asked, the answer began to take shape, a system designed not just to control land, but to control what that land produced. The solution did not arrive with a single moment. It emerged quietly, step by step. But when it became clear, it changed everything. Instead of treating colonies as isolated territories, empires began to redesign them, not as distant lands, but as parts of a system. Each colony was given a role, a purpose. Some produced raw materials, others processed goods, others became trade hubs, moving resources across oceans. Nothing was random anymore. Production was organized, extraction was controlled, trade was directed, and most importantly, everything was connected. Resources didn't just leave a colony by chance. They moved through planned routes, at expected volumes, at predictable intervals. For the first time, uncertainty began to shrink, and in its place, something new appeared, structure, a structure that could be repeated, scaled, expanded across multiple regions at once. This was the real breakthrough, because wealth was no longer something that simply flowed. It was engineered, designed to move in a specific direction, designed to benefit a specific center. And once the system proved it could work, it didn't stay small. It spread, adapting to new lands, reshaping entire regions. And that's where its true power begins to reveal itself. In certain regions, this system became impossible to ignore. You could see it in motion. Vast lands dedicated to a single purpose. Fields producing one crop again and again. Mines extracting resources at a relentless pace. Nothing diversified. Nothing accidental. Everything was focused on output. Raw materials were taken at scale. Sugar, cotton, metals, produced in large quantities, not for local use, but for export. Then they were shipped across oceans, following fixed routes, at regular intervals. And when they arrived, they didn't stay raw. They were processed elsewhere, refined, manufactured into finished goods. Only then were they sold, often back into global markets, sometimes even back to the same regions they came from. Each step had a role. Each movement had a purpose. Extraction, transport, processing, sale, all connected, all controlled. Nothing was left to chance. And within this system, the colony itself changed. It was no longer just a place on a map. It became a function, a single part inside a much larger machine, a machine designed to produce value continuously. And once this model proved effective, it didn't remain limited to a few regions. It expanded, refined, replicated, until entire empires began to operate the same way. Once the model proved it could work, it didn't stay contained. It spread quickly. Other empires were watching, learning, adapting, because the advantage was clear. This was no longer just about control. It was about efficiency, about turning distant territories into reliable sources of wealth. So the structure began to repeat. Across continents, across oceans, different empires applied the same logic. Assign roles, control production, direct trade. But they didn't just copy it. They refined it, improved coordination, expanded scale, increased speed. The system became more precise, more interconnected. And as it grew, something important began to change. It stopped belonging to any one empire, because the same patterns appeared everywhere. Different flags, but identical structures. Extraction in one place, processing in another, profit flowing to the center. What began as an experiment became a global pattern, a system that operated beyond borders. And over time, it grew larger than the empires themselves. Because even as empires rose and fell, the structure remained, adapting, continuing, waiting to take a new form. Today, the language has changed. We don't talk about colonies in the same way. We don't describe systems as empires. But if you look closely, the structure feels familiar. Resources still move across borders. Raw materials are sourced in one region, Manufacturing happens in another. Products are sold somewhere else. The flow continues. Production is fragmented, split into stages, optimized across different locations. Each place assigned a role, each step designed for efficiency. And value is still extracted at scale, not always through direct control, but through systems of trade, contracts, and global networks. The geography looks different. The maps have changed, but the logic remains. Because what mattered was never the shape of the empire. It was the structure behind it. A structure that organizes movement, controls production, and directs where wealth ultimately goes. This is why the system never truly disappeared. It adapted, evolved into something more complex, more connected, more difficult to see. And once you recognize it, a deeper realization begins to form. Maybe this was never just about history. Maybe it's about how the world still works today. What made this system so powerful wasn't just efficiency. It was invisibility. At first, the structure was obvious. Ships, routes, controlled production. But over time, it faded into the background, not because it disappeared, but because it became normal. The flow of goods felt natural. The movement of resources felt expected. People no longer saw a system. They saw everyday life. Products on shelves, materials arriving on time, markets functioning without interruption. Everything seemed ordinary, but underneath that surface, the same structure remained, organizing, directing, extracting, and most people never questioned it because they interacted with the outputs, not the design. They saw the results, not the system that produced them, and that's what gave it power, because a system that is visible can be challenged, but a system that feels natural rarely is. So it continued, quietly shaping economies, guiding decisions, influencing daily life without being noticed, not through force, but through familiarity. And that is why it endured, because the most effective systems are not the ones you see. They are the ones you stop noticing. The story of colonial wealth is not just about the past. It is about the creation of a system that changed how value moves through the world. What began as a way to manage distant lands became something much larger. Land was no longer just territory. It became output. And that output was turned into continuous profit, again and again, across regions, across time. This was the real transformation, because once value could be structured, it could be controlled. And once it could be controlled, it could be scaled. That logic didn't disappear with empires. It continued, evolving into new forms, embedding itself into global systems we still rely on today. Trade networks, supply chains, economic flows that feel natural, but are deeply designed. And this is why the story still matters. Because once you see the system, you begin to recognize it everywhere. In the movement of goods, in the structure of markets, in the way value is created, and where it ultimately goes. And once you see it, it becomes impossible to ignore. If you want to understand how hidden systems shape power, past and present, this is only the beginning, because the structures that built empires didn't disappear. They adapted. They became more complex, more embedded in everyday life, still shaping how value moves, still influencing the world around you. Subscribe to explore the invisible systems still shaping the world today.